Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Scott Garber back in the saddle of the Profluent Sports Podcast, where we are highlighting founders, executives, advisors across the whole sporting landscape. Today, we are highlighting a founder, Mr. Greg Glass from FanStake, who is pioneering and carving out a very new mechanism in a chaotic, turbulent space that we call name, image, and likeness. It's not my story to tell. I'm excited to bring my man Greg on and dive right into it. Greg, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Scott. Excited to be here. Big fan of Profluence and everything you guys are doing. So fired up for our conversation.
Man, back at you. And, it takes a brave soul to, put your shoulder in as, the foundation is getting rocked at the collegiate level right now. So, Greg, just for our listeners to sort of level set the playing field before we go into FanStake, give them a little sense of who you are, what your journey's been like, sort of leading up to this moment where, you started this build.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. It takes a brave soul, but also that's part of startups, right? I think a lot of the folks listening to this podcast are founders, likely business owners or people trying to get into the space. And I think one of the reasons we were most interested was the fact that it's chaotic. I think that's usually where you see a lot of the interesting things happening when there's these monumental shifts that rarely happen in any industry. So take a step back, the co-founders, Donnie, Alex, and I are longtime friends. I've known them now and Donnie, we go all the way back to college days. But the first company we were all at, we were executives at a company called Bizzo, which was a B2B ad tech company. We started with a number of others, including my brother, who was our CEO back in 2008. Ultimately, we grew it to a couple hundred employees, sold it to LinkedIn in 2014, had that great startup experience and learned a ton. A lot of things went wrong, a lot of things went right. Ultimately, though, great exit, great experience at LinkedIn, but went on in different directions. So Alex most recently was the chief technology officer at Headspace, the meditation app people might be familiar with.
Sure.
Donnie was another CTO at multiple different companies. I was working at a Series C prop tech, but we came together not because we wanted to necessarily work on this, but we wanted to work together first and foremost, like just knew the culture we wanted to build, knew the kind of company we wanted to build. And the idea for FanStake was one of like 7 different ideas. And this was one that was front of mind for me for a while. And it actually goes back to several years back, Zion Williamson. And I am a Duke fan. I hope people don't hold that against me. A few of us are. And it's always controversial to come out with that, but we're big Duke fans. Zion was clearly the number 1 draft choice, right? That year. They were crushing it. And he was interviewed and he was like, actually, I don't really want to go to the NBA. Like, I'm 18 years old. I'm having the time of my life. Why am I in this position where I'm forced to take that jump? And we were talking like, actually, you could potentially kickstart this kid back to school. Think about all the Duke fans around the country. If we all just chipped in $5, $10, what could you do? Now, at the time, that was against the NCAA bylaws. Obviously, things have changed since then. And so really the green light for us was last year there was a federal injunction in Tennessee that basically the judge said, look, you can't continue to prohibit these athletes from negotiating in advance of selecting a school. And in effect, that's all FanStake is. It's a negotiation platform where you understand what an endorsement opportunity would look like if you go to, let's say, Knoxville versus Durham, whatever it might be, right? Yep. And that is what we ended up building. And so got the team together, recruited some fantastic folks, raised a little bit of money, and we were off and running.
No, I mean, and look, I think, we talk about the foundation and the origin story being so imperative. It's always neat to, sort of have that embedded culture and now, sort of come back to the drawing board. I am curious though, like when you were going through that 7, right, and you're looking at this, I agree, this may be a generational move that we're watching, and we'll dive into what's going on in the NCAA. What was that process like from, sort of starting at 7 and narrowing it all the way down? I think, we watch a lot of founders have sort of paralysis by analysis and they struggle to make that decision, or, was that more of an intuitive thing? It's like, hey, this is the right time with the right team? Or like, what was that moment that said, hey, let's hit go and this is it?
We knew we had the right team, which was one of the advantages we had. And from a technical standpoint, and I'm the dumb sales guy on the team, like these guys are very technical, can kind of build anything in the software front, but didn't totally know what the right business was. And it was actually very quantitative. It wasn't, this irrational, passionate thing. It was literally a spreadsheet with 15 different categories, everything from fundability to TAM to interest in this area to, is it disruptive? Is it controversial? Like you need a level of controversy to some extent to especially in a consumer space, to get over the hump. And so all of that was very practical. And it, we actually are not the kind of group that was necessarily going after the sexiest industry, although this is like a super fun industry to be in. Obviously, we're passionate fans. The reality is, as founders, you're looking for holes. You're looking for problems that aren't solved. And often those are in the least sexy areas. And so some of the ideas we were talking about were AI and ed tech to solve IEP stuff for special needs students. And, like really going deep, just because I would overhear my wife talking about like their outdated software and this stuff hasn't changed since the 90s, and look at it and be like, oh my God, you're right. And like, we would be like, that's an opportunity. And so it was not intuition. It was very much like, let's play this out and be very practical about it. And do we think there's an opportunity? And so for FanStake, the reason we ultimately settled on this was the fact that it's in this transition period, the fact that you have this enormous industry that is changing on what feels like a daily, but weekly basis,
hourly at this point, doesn't
exactly.
it, Greg? Like you don't know what's coming up on your phone.
Yeah, it's constant. I wake up every morning, and you look at your phone, and be like, all right, well, that's new.
Yeah.
And when you have those kind of seismic shifts in something that's so also ingrained in American culture, the history and the tradition of college sports is one of the most important things in America. At least growing up where I grew up, like it's always been something like, I've been passionate about and the people around me have been passionate about. So it was just a unique opportunity. I think timing more than anything is what drove this decision.
Yeah. And I mean, look, it's, I think if you were doing this a couple of years ago, Greg, we saw, the first wave, it was all marketplaces, right? And it was like, how do we start to strategically align and connect? I have a couple of questions. I want to stay here. And then I think we'll get more into the broader market of what's going on in the space and where you see it going. From a founder's lens, you guys get this idea. I think that there were enough beacons out there that said there's product market fit. What was that journey like for raising capital, right? Like there's, when we see so much change, it's hard to quantify, against historicals. What was that process like to get, and secure capital to go actually take this vision and bring it to life?
Yeah. And look, raising capital is never easy. And
Sure.
I know that I have a lot of friends who are founders or going through this process. It's challenging because you could have a brilliant idea, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a venture-backed idea, which, by the way, like I think everyone tends to want to run to venture capital. That's not always the best fit depending on the business. In fact, we started off talking about businesses where we wouldn't have to raise capital, where we could potentially bootstrap it, because there's a lot of advantages to that model. And so before talking about raising the capital, I think that it's important people understand that you have to really assess whether or not it's a business that should raise capital, because there are downsides. And for us, I think the reality was all the different VC firms we talked with, and so it was Will Ventures, Sousa Ventures, and a couple others who led that pre-seed round back about a year ago. And they, even Sousa, which is more of a Silicon Valley firm, was very interested in NIL. And all of these VCs, in this ecosystem are looking very closely at it. And it's more about finding the fit that you see, like, can this be scaled as a venture-sized business? And it's not, if we can have $10 million business, which would be incredible. It's, can this be $1 billion+ business? And so that's really what is unique about going to VCs. And you have to think about it like, are we in this game where we're trying to scale as fast as possible, get as many users, as much as adoption, and you need the capital to do that? ultimately, we initially made that assessment that, yeah, this is the kind of business where that's essential. But then we brought a number of things to the table that we felt like were unique in this ecosystem that no one has tapped into. And I think one of our competitive advantages, frankly, was the fact that we were tech entrepreneurs coming to sports rather than sports entrepreneurs coming to tech. And there is a little bit of a difference. And I think that, that we have so many fantastic people in the sports industry, really smart, talented, and they've seen it through the years. But a lot of what we were bringing were things that we did in these wonky B2B spaces and building ad tech-like products for the sports world. And that, in some ways, is the harder part. And so I think that gave us a little bit of a leg up. And we happened to connect with incredible investors. So, Will Ventures, again, they led the first round there with Sousa. But then, this last round, courtside, you couldn't get a better lead than these guys. They're so deep in it in every aspect, whether it's regulatory, gamification, the compliance side of it, the collectible side of it. And they've been looking at NIL for a long time, and they felt like we were very aligned with the vision of where can this go. So it was just the right partnership, the right time.
No, it's really cool. And I think that alignment, we talk so much about it, Greg, is it's sort of like dating or finding your wife, right? Like you're going to be, really committed with this partner, and, not all relationships are created equal, right? So it's really neat to hear sort of your perspective. I think there's a lot of nuggets that we can go and extract from that. But ultimately, like when we do see alignment with capital and founder, it typically pushes a really good product out to the market, right? So, and that we lose scope of sometimes, right? We get so enamored with the game of business that sometimes we forget what the end product is. And, Greg, like I know we've sort of hopped right into the deep end, but let's take a step back, like dumbify it for our listeners. What are you guys building? Like what exactly is FanStake?
Yeah. And I couldn't agree with that assessment, by the way, with the VCs being like a marriage. And that is it. You've got to be willing to have honest conversations about what's working, what's not. And that's where the folks we have on our cap table have just been brilliant. So FanStake, the short of it is, the simplest way to explain it is it's kind of a competitive recruiting platform where fans are able to participate in the NIL endorsement deals for their teams. And so the way it would work, let's say as a fan of Duke, I want to see Isaiah Evans return next year. And what I can do is put, let's say it's $20 on Isaiah to play at Duke next year. If he ends up coming back to Duke, it converts into an endorsement deal that's funded by the Duke fan base. But it's an endorsement deal between FanStake and Isaiah Evans. Ultimately, he's endorsing FanStake. Now, if he decides that he wants to put his name in the transfer portal and he's going to go play at, let's say it's NC State instead, right? Me as a Duke fan, I actually get my money back. And it's the NC State fan base that would end up funding that endorsement. And so it does a couple things. One, it creates this unique element where it's competitive. And so you start to get free market dynamics. So an athlete can understand like, all right, well, if I was to select NC State, here's the opportunity for me. If I select Duke, here's the opportunity for me. Now, a lot of this is happening already, but it happens behind closed doors, behind the scenes, and it's very opaque. And so our whole feeling was like, can you shine a light on this? Can you actually bring the fan base in and show true supply and demand? Because that's the one thing that's really missing in this. This is very much professional sports, and we have a strong opinion on that. And professional sports in capitalist democracy, we want to show supply and demand. We want to show the market economics of this. And that's part of what FanStake is trying to do, where you need to expose it and you need to make it an open market to sort of get to like, what is fair market value for the athletes? And eventually you reach in equilibrium. I think the second part of it is it allows these, what we call and what the collectives often call retail fans, to have a say, to have some influence, to actually be able to say like, all right, I may not be a booster like Larry Ellison, but $50 for a better team? Sure. And if we don't get it, I get my money back. That's a very low risk proposition. And so the idea is like, how do we make this fun for the fans where they can actually sort of GM their team a little bit and say like, yes, absolutely, I want that player. those other players aren't necessarily who I want to invest in, and gamify it as much as possible. And so a lot of it's going to be about fan engagement, but then it's also like maximizing the NIL opportunities for the athletes and also democratizing this process. So the other thing we've seen is that the Power Four schools at the very top, they've got the money. I think that they're going to be fine. Where a lot of the schools are working with us are G5 and beyond, because they're struggling and they don't necessarily have these big boosters who can come in and just support the team at a level that's going to make them competitive. So you need to tap into your fan base. And that's the one thing that every school has. Even if you're, a random school, G5 out west, and you don't have huge budgets, you usually have big fan bases who are fanatical, who are willing to chip in a little bit to stay competitive. And that's what we're enabling.
100%. I mean, look, I played football at South Alabama, right? And it's, you sort of sit in that, in that bucket there. It totally resonates. I'm going to ask, I got a couple questions on this. So now we're watching, we'll go to the team level. We're watching groups like Republic, where you can get the fan involved more at the ownership level of these teams and democratizing those opportunities beyond just allocating funds towards, having a say in where the player goes. Are there added benefits for the fans? Is there a community element to this that now you're getting unique, behind the scenes experiences? Or what does that look like if they actually like transact and your money goes to use there?
100%. So that's really what we're focused on right now. Right now, we have like a reward system in place. And so as you're engaging on the platform, as you're staking athletes and participating, as you're sharing, you're earning points that can convert to anything from merchandise and gift cards to actually experiences with the team. But longer term, we really want to build community. We really want, and because the athletes are also, the one thing we've learned that's been fascinating is they love this, overwhelming support from the athletes, where if they have the ability to connect directly with the fan base, give them, some exclusive behind the scenes and content, also collectibles, and them sort of owning their brand a little bit more, they're really excited about it. And so what we're working right now is really marrying those things together, where it's we want fans participating, but we want them to be constantly rewarded more and more for that participation, for building that community, and for, on our side, it's playing the games on FanStake. So we're going to be gamifying a lot of it, where when you're winning, when you're successful, you're actually getting more and more NIL for your team. And so it's going to be a really fun platform. We're at the very beginning of it. And so that core staking concept was the MVP product, if you will. Yeah. And we're really expanding from there, where the idea is that we want the deepest fan engagement we can possibly get. And what ends up happening, if you could bring your fan base together and they're engaged and they're communicating and they're moving as a tribe, you actually have a lot of influence there. And so that's ultimately what we're trying to build.
Very cool. Very cool. So now, obviously, we alluded to this at the top of the episode here. The NCAA is going through a lot right now. We've had, NIL introduced, on the back of COVID. We've had the transfer portal, which has, compounded that. And we have the House case going on right now. So I want to get your pulse on, how are you guys making decisions in such a turbulent and, sort of fluctuating market? We'll stop there. How are you guys sort of building a forecasted roadmap where you don't know what's coming, behind door number 3?
It's hard. Absolutely. And so we're trying to remain as nimble as possible, but also always kind of thinking about the true north. At the end of the day, our belief is that fan engagement is always going to be important. Brands are going to want to be able to connect with these athletes at scale. And so figuring that piece out. And the schools, regardless of how this plays out, they have a revenue shortfall. We haven't talked to one school in the country that just felt very comfortable. Even the ones that you think have the most money and have been reported as such, it turns out they don't just have $20 million lying around that they feel very comfortable in paying out. You have to either make cuts or find new ways to raise money. And so what we've seen consistently from these schools, the feedback is that their funds are either fickle in terms of performance on the field and merchandise sales and ticket sales, et cetera, fixed in terms of multimedia revenue or media contracts with, conferences, et cetera. And then you've got the donors. That's their only other channel, really.
Yep.
And so even the donors are now saying, oh, you can pay directly I don't need to pay anymore. And it's the opposite. They actually need to commit even more. And so our whole thing is like, all right, how can we make sure we're building in this environment where we're helping all of those different constituents? And so we think about the collectives, we think about the university, we think about the NCAA, we think about the athletes, the fans, coaches, athletic directors. They all have slightly different opinions. And our true feeling is none of them are wrong. Like everyone tends to point fingers, but the truth is like everyone's trying to do the best they can. NCAA gets a lot of criticism, but frankly, like, they're trying to maintain this tradition, something that's been going on for 100 years. And have they screwed things up? Absolutely. But at the same time, I think their hearts are in the right place and trying to transition to something where they know athletes do need to get paid now. This is professionalized. How do we do it in a way where we don't lose the heart and soul of this? Everything we do, we try to assess it from the different viewpoints and try to say like, all right, yes, we want to build for the athletes and the fans, but can the NCAA or the schools adopt this in a way where it feels fair for them and right? And do they still have controls and so on? And so I think that's kind of our true north in terms of how do you navigate when the sands are constantly shifting. Yep. It's like, well, however they shift from the legal front, we do assume the House settlement's going to go through in some form. And I do think eventually Congress will act. I don't think there's going to be an antitrust exclusion, but I do think they're going to have some kind of impact to more likely just solidify the House settlement. We feel like there's going to be a world where we can play an important role. And so, yeah, just being aware of it, but not being overly distracted because you could wake up every day and pivot your whole business and think it's the wrong.
Well, and I mean, shout out to Jeremy Boone and Winning Leader. Like we talk so much about that promised land, right? And I think like when you have that promised land and the mission that backs it up, regardless of what externally is happening, you're still able to go ahead and run your race, right? And so, it's always neat. You call it the North Star, but, you can only let the outside factors dictate so much of where the business goes. And so now, with this ripple of what's going on, there was always a clear path from, youth amateur athletics. And, the goal was always to go get a scholarship. Yeah. As a byproduct of what's going on at the collegiate level, we're watching commercialization happen younger and younger. So I'm curious from the FanStake lens, you look at some of these elite prep schools, you look at some of these elite boarding schools, these elite soccer, circuits. Are you guys taking the same principles and bringing this downstream and capturing their athlete earlier in their journey? Or are you hyper focused at the collegiate level right now?
We are hyper focused, but that's not to say that there's not a huge opportunity there. And I think that there are a number of companies who are going downstream, going younger and younger. And as a parent, I think it's a great idea because I think anyone who is involved with youth sports knows like how complex this is getting and how much demand there is. And I think every high school in America has a number of students who think they have an opportunity, and they may indeed have an opportunity. Our belief, though, is one is like we can't boil the ocean. There's only so much we can do. And so we want to stay hyper focused. And the thing about like this situation, and there is a lot of criticism today on like, all right, what is that North Star? What ultimately are we getting towards? Our belief is actually NIL, the transfer portal, all of this is making college sports better. Now it's a rocky interim. Like I'll admit that it's going to be a transition period, but there's going to be more parity. There's going to be kids who are earning fair market value. You're seeing this already where NBA draft, for example, the lowest entries ever. And part of that is because kids can stay and earn. And as kids stay, there are more opportunities at other schools because those roster spots are taken up at some of the premier ones, right? And you saw it in the college football playoff. You're seeing it across the board in other areas where we're going to have a better product on the field and on the court. And so I think it just takes some patience. I think there's a lot of media and a lot of noise, but just being aware of that. And I think for the athletes too, the way I think about it in terms of focusing on them at the younger age, to your question, it's partially the fact that they don't have more than 4 years to capitalize on this opportunity. And the fact is, NCAA at large is the second largest league in the world behind the NFL in terms of revenue. And these kids deserve their compensation, but most of them are not going to go on to a higher level. And so if you've got 4 years to capitalize on this, go do it. I can't blame them at all. head of partnerships, Andrew Phillips, was starting offensive guard during Andrew Luck's Orange Bowl team back at Stanford. They had a ton of branding around them, all this stuff, but this was before NIL. He probably could have made $500,000 back in the day, which would have been game changing for him and his family today. And so, like, I look back, and he never played in the NFL. So I look at the kids today, and I really have this feeling like they need to take advantage of the opportunity while it's in front of them, and we need to allow that to happen.
Yeah. I mean, look at sides. I've been on both sides of it now, and whether you like it or not, it's here. Right? Yeah. It's here. And so I think it's really exciting in the position we get to sit where you get to see all the capital flowing in, but just as important, Greg, we get to see all the innovation that's happening and the creative solutions. Whereas in sports, we sort of saw the same things recycled over and over again. And now, this Ripple is, as a byproduct brought in new, fresh perspective like yourself, to push this space forward. Before we turn and sort of take this thing home, one thing that we're seeing a lot in the NIL space, and I'm curious with where you guys are engaging with the athletes, is how do you think about education from this, right? So now, you guys are able to go ahead and be a vehicle to put more athlete or money in athletes' pocket. Is there a fiduciary responsibility around putting financial literacy, making sure that, they understand the taxes and the implications? Some of that is theoretical when they teach it in school, but this one seems more practical as you guys are actually distributing, the money to the players. How do you guys think about that internally?
Absolutely. Look, think back to when we were in college. I remember going to the ATM for the first time, not knowing how any of this works. So
I still don't know how that works, Greg.
And so I think it is something that everyone in this industry should be aware of, and you need to provide that education. And we've worked with a number of partners and are going to continue to work on the education side. Part of it is simple stuff, like letting them know, hey, because the way we work with athletes is they're 1099 contractors for us, and taxes are not taken out. And so you need to allocate a certain amount for taxes, and we're working with partners where actually we can maybe put that aside right away and let them know, this is how this works. You don't really have this total number. You're going to owe the government this amount, and things like that. How can you open up an interest-bearing account right away? Whether or not you should actually register as an LLC. There are a lot of great opportunities out there right now, and there's a number of companies working on this that are all about the educational elements. And we want to incorporate that however we can, because I agree the responsibility is on all of us to make sure that we're doing this the right way. And, I certainly don't blame the kids for not knowing how to do it. I definitely didn't at that age. And to your point, there's still a lot that I'm confused about.
Yeah.
It's very easy for us to get them that information.
No, that's great. And, I think that's the 360 side of this, right? Where sports, we talked about before we hopped on, it's where you learn all of life's lessons, right? And now I think this is another vehicle where you get to learn one of life's real lessons, which is, tax and death are two of the only things that you can count on in life, So,
that's true.
Greg, this is so insightful, man, both from your personal journey, into what you built. And, I want to leave, sort of with, what's your hot take? Where do you see this thing going, both the market and your company? What's got you excited on the horizon for the rest of 25?
Oh, man, this is maybe the one industry where a hot take is really difficult.
We'll listen to it in a year and you'll be like, what was I thinking?
No, I was way off. No, look, what I really believe is going to happen is I do think the House settlement will pass. I do think that there will be some level of congressional action. And I think that the first real test is going to be this clearinghouse operated by Deloitte. And can they really actually stop anything? I think it's hard because the reality behind the scenes that everyone in the industry knows is that this is still illegal. It's still an antitrust violation. You're still colluding amongst yourselves as schools to set a salary cap on an audience that has not agreed to it. And so at the end of the day, I think collective bargaining will come too. And it's going to take some time for all of this to play out, but it will stabilize and we're going to have a better product. It's just going to take a little bit of time.
I think it's a great hot take. And, I think as we look back at it, for as much information as we have right now, I think your finger's right on the pulse. And, we'll be excited to watch you guys navigate, continue to iterate and empower the space, with an athlete first vision here, which for us is so neat, as to where the space is going. So Greg from Profluent Sports, we can't thank you enough for coming on, and more importantly, leaning in and building and improving the sporting ecosystem. If folks want to get in touch with you, whether it's athletes, potential partners, where can they find you and reach out?
Yeah, absolutely. Partnerships at fanstake.com, or reach out to me. I'm just Greg at fanstake.com. I love talking with the community. This is the kind of thing where it takes a village. And I know there's a lot of folks in the Profluence community as well that we could be working with. And so very excited to talk to all the members.
I love it. And he's an easy one to talk to. So don't hesitate. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. Greg Glass, thank you so much for taking some time out of your busy schedule to come drop some knowledge with us, and excited to watch your guys' journey.
Thanks, Scott. This is a blast. I appreciate it.
Talk soon.